I know I'm just an old guy spinning tales, but some tales aren't meant to be ignored. Trust me, you'll want to hear this one. So turn down the lights, settle in, and let's dive into today's chilling stories. Before we begin, a fair warning. What you're about to hear is purely for entertainment. These stories and theories, they're nothing more than shadows in the dark. No proof, just whispers carried by the night. Listen closely, but don't say, "I didn't warn you." Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In this video, we delve into 5 chilling stories that push the boundaries of fear and suspense. Starting with a tale about a library that keeps its secrets and its visitors. The haunting of the library. Marcus had always dreamed of working in a library. He loved the quiet, the smell of old books, and the way time seemed to stand still within those walls. When he landed a job at the Thornwood Public Library in a small, remote town, it felt like a dream come true. The library, built in 1912, was a grand structure with towering shelves, stained glass windows, and a mysterious reputation. Locals often joked about the ghost librarian who roamed the aisles, searching for books that no longer existed. Marcus dismissed the stories as harmless folklore, a way for the townspeople to add some intrigue to their otherwise uneventful lives. He found the idea charming, a quirk that gave the place character. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. Marcus grew familiar with the layout of the sprawling building and its labyrinth of aisles. He enjoyed the serenity and the occasional interaction with the library's patrons. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was never truly alone. Sometimes, as he shelved books or worked late into the evening, he felt the prickling sensation of being watched. He would glance over his shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. One particular section of the library always gave him pause: the archives. Tucked away in the basement, it held decades-old records, maps, and books no longer in circulation. Few patrons ventured down there, and the air always felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. Despite his unease, Marcus was drawn to the archives, intrigued by the promise of discovering forgotten stories and hidden treasures. Little did he know, the archives held secrets far darker than he could ever imagine. It started with a tapping. On an otherwise quiet evening, Marcus was cataloging books when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoing through the library. At first, he thought it was just the old building settling, a mundane sound amplified by the silence. But as the minutes passed, the tapping grew louder and more deliberate, as if it were coming closer. Marcus paused, straining to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the archives. His heart quickened as he debated whether to investigate. Shaking off his nerves, he grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the basement. The staircase leading to the archives was steep and narrow, the light bulb overhead flickering sporadically. As he descended, the tapping stopped. Marcus hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, his breath catching in his throat. The air was colder here, and the musty smell of old paper was almost overwhelming. He walked slowly through the rows of shelves, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Everything seemed normal at first, but then he noticed something odd. A book lying open on the floor, its pages fluttering slightly, as though stirred by an invisible breeze. Marcus crouched down to pick it up. The book's title, Histories Unwritten, was embossed in faded gold letters on the spine. He had never seen it before. As he held the book, The tapping resumed, this time louder and more insistent. Marcus spun around, his flashlight darting across the shelves, but there was no one there. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper within the archives. Against his better judgment, he followed it. The deeper he went, the stranger the atmosphere became. The rows of shelves seemed to stretch endlessly, and the books appeared older and more worn. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as a faint whisper joined the tapping. The words were indecipherable, but their tone was unmistakably beckoning. Finally, he reached the farthest corner of the archives, where a narrow doorway stood slightly ajar. He could have sworn it hadn't been there before. Beyond the doorway, a dim light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Marcus hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but curiosity compelled him forward. As he stepped through the doorway, the tapping and whispers ceased abruptly. He found himself in a small circular room, lined with ancient, leather-bound books. In the center of the room stood a single table, and on it lay an open book. The pages were blank, except for one line written in bold black ink. "Welcome, Marcus." A chill ran down his spine as the door behind him creaked shut, sealing him inside. Marcus's breath caught as the dim light in the circular room flickered and dimmed further. He approached the table cautiously, his eyes darting to the books lining the walls. Unlike the ones in the archives, these books were pristine, their leather covers gleaming as though they were newly bound. Yet, there were no titles, no markings, no way to tell what they contained. The air in the room grew heavy, as if an unseen force was pressing down on him. Marcus reached out to touch the book on the table, his fingers trembling. The moment his hand made contact, the room seemed to hum with energy, and the whispers returned, this time clearer. "You've come," they said in unison, their tones a mix of relief and malice. Marcus staggered back, nearly knocking over the table. The book's pages began to turn on their own, faster and faster, until they abruptly stopped. On the newly revealed page, in the same bold black ink, were the words, "Do you accept your fate?" Marcus's mind raced. What fate? What was this place? He backed toward the door, only to find it had vanished. The wall was now seamless, as if the door had never existed. Panic surged through him as the whispers grew louder, overlapping and repeating the same phrase. "Do you accept?" Desperate, Marcus shouted, "Accept what? Who are you? What do you want?" The whispers fell silent. The room grew colder, and for a moment there was nothing but stillness. Then a single voice spoke, deep and resonant, echoing as though it came from everywhere at once. "Your curiosity brought you here, Marcus. Now it binds you." The books on the shelves began to vibrate, some falling to the floor and opening to blank pages that quickly filled with ink, words scrawling themselves in jagged handwriting. Marcus glanced at one of the books and saw his own name, followed by fragments of his life story. Every detail was accurate, down to the very moment he had stepped into the hidden room. Terrified, Marcus turned back to the table. The book's pages were blank again, save for a single line. "Write your ending." A quill appeared beside the book, its tip already dripping with ink. Marcus hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for it. The voice returned, softer now, almost coaxing. "Your story is not yet finished, but how it ends is up to you." Marcus's mind spun with possibilities. Was this a way out or a trap? He hesitated, the weight of the quill in his hand feeling heavier than it should. The room seemed to lean in around him, waiting. Marcus stared at the quill, its dark ink forming a small, glistening pool on the table. The whispers had stopped, but their weight lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. He thought of the message in the book. Write your ending. The words churned in his mind, both a command and a warning. Slowly, Marcus lowered the quill to the blank page. As the tip touched the surface, the ink spread unnaturally, forming words without his guidance. To leave, you must remember. To stay, you must forget. Marcus recoiled, his heart pounding. What did it mean? Remember what? Forget what? He looked at the walls of books, each one vibrating slightly, as though eager for him to choose. I don't understand, Marcus whispered aloud, his voice trembling. The room didn't respond this time. Instead, the words on the page began to rearrange themselves, forming new sentences. The truth binds you here. A lie will set you free. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the room seemed to close in on him. The quill in his hand felt alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his racing heart. He wanted to drop it, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room had become a prison, and the only key was ink and paper. With shaking hands, Marcus began to write. He scrawled his name first, then hesitated. His mind raced through every memory he held dear, every truth that defined him. The air grew colder as he wrote, My name is Marcus. I am a librarian. I came here to find knowledge. As he wrote, the walls began to change. The books rearranged themselves, their spines glowing faintly with symbols he couldn't read. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost sorrowful. The page in front of him changed again, revealing a single final choice. Leave the truth behind or remain with it forever. Marcus froze. Could he let go of everything he knew, every memory that made him who he was? His hand trembled over the quill as he considered the weight of his decision. In the end, he chose... Marcus closed his eyes, letting the weight of the decision settle in his mind. His hand, trembling but resolute, moved the quill to the page. I leave the truth behind, he wrote, the ink spreading across the page like blood soaking into fabric. As the final letter was completed, the room erupted into motion. The bookshelves swirled around him in a whirlwind of paper and light. The whispers returned, a chaotic symphony of voices, rising in intensity until they merged into a single, piercing note. Marcus dropped the quill and covered his ears, sinking to his knees as the room seemed to collapse around him. Then, silence. When Marcus opened his eyes, he was standing in the center of the library's main floor. The lights were bright, the air was warm, and the distant hum of conversation filled the space. Patrons moved about, oblivious to his presence. He looked down at his hands, half expecting to see ink-stained fingers, but they were clean. Relief flooded over him, but it was short-lived. Something was missing. He couldn't remember why he had gone to the archives in the first place. He couldn't remember anything beyond his name and the fact that he worked here. His memories were gone, erased like chalk from a blackboard. Marcus turned towards the archives, feeling a vague unease. The doorway was there, just as he remembered it, but it no longer felt ominous. It was just a room, ordinary, unremarkable. He hesitated, then turned away, choosing not to dwell on what he couldn't explain. As he returned to his desk, a patron approached with a book. "Excuse me," they said, handing it to him. The title caught his eye. Histories Unwritten. Marcus stared at it, his heart pounding. The cover was blank, the faded gold letters gone. He opened it, but the pages were empty. Yet as he handed it back, he felt a strange sense of peace. Maybe some stories were better left untold. From that day on, Marcus never ventured into the archives again. But sometimes, late at night, when the library was silent and still, he could swear he heard faint whispers calling his name. The abandoned hospital. The old St. Augustine Hospital had been abandoned for decades. Nestled on the outskirts of the city, it was shrouded in mystery and grim stories of malpractice and unexplainable deaths. For a group of thrill-seeking friends, it was the perfect spot for their next ghost-hunting adventure. Late one night, 5 of them, Sarah, Jason, Mia, Liam, and Emma, gathered at the rusted gates. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a spirit box, they entered the building. The air inside was heavy and damp, the scent of mildew and decay clinging to every surface. Graffiti covered the peeling walls, and shards of glass from shattered windows crunched underfoot. "This place gives me the creeps," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the echoing silence. Jason smirked. "That's the point, isn't it? Let's see if this haunted hospital lives up to the hype." The group moved cautiously through the darkened corridors. Their flashlights illuminated rusted gurneys, discarded medical equipment, and faded posters warning about hygiene practices. The atmosphere was oppressive, and every creak of the old building made them jump. As they ventured deeper into the hospital, they reached the surgical wing. The air was colder here, and their breath fogged in front of them. Jason, ever the skeptic, suggested they split up to cover more ground. Reluctantly, the group agreed. Sarah and Mia explored the patient rooms, finding dusty beds with restraints still attached. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she noticed scratches on the walls, as though someone had desperately tried to escape. Meanwhile, Jason and Liam entered the operating theater. A rusted operating table stood in the center of the room, and surgical tools lay scattered on a tray. Jason picked up a scalpel, its blade dull and stained. "Looks like they left in a hurry," he muttered. Emma stayed behind in the hallway, keeping watch. As the others investigated, she swore she heard faint whispers. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, morphing into agonized moans. Emma turned toward the sound, her flashlight flickering. At the end of the hallway, a shadow moved. "Guys!" she screamed, backing up. The group rushed to her, their flashlights converging on the empty corridor. "I saw something," Emma stammered. "There was someone down there." Jason rolled his eyes. "It's just your imagination. Let's keep going." But as they turned to leave, the shadow reappeared, closer this time. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The group froze in terror as the figure let out a guttural growl and began to move toward them. When Marcus opened his eyes, he was standing in the center of the library's main floor. The lights were bright, the air was warm, and the distant hum of conversation filled the space. Patrons moved about, oblivious to his presence. He looked down at his hands, half expecting to see ink-stained fingers, but they were clean. Relief flooded over him, but it was short-lived. Something was missing. He couldn't remember why he had gone to the archives in the first place. He couldn't remember anything beyond his name and the fact that he worked here. His memories were gone, erased like chalk from a blackboard. Marcus turned toward the archives, feeling a vague unease. The doorway was there, just as he remembered it, but it no longer felt ominous. It was just a room, ordinary, unremarkable. He hesitated, then turned away, choosing not to dwell on what he couldn't explain. As he returned to his desk, a patron approached with a book. "Excuse me," they said, handing it to him. The title caught his eye. Histories Unwritten. Marcus stared at it, his heart pounding. The cover was blank, the faded gold letters gone. He opened it, but the pages were empty. Yet, as he handed it back, he felt a strange sense of peace. Maybe some stories were better left untold. From that day on, Marcus never ventured into the archives again. But sometimes, late at night, when the library was silent and still, he could swear he heard faint whispers calling his name. The abandoned hospital. The old St. Augustine Hospital had been abandoned for decades. Nestled on the outskirts of the city, it was shrouded in mystery and grim stories of malpractice and unexplainable deaths. For a group of thrill-seeking friends, it was the perfect spot for their next ghost-hunting adventure. Late one night, 5 of them, Sarah, Jason, Mia, Liam, and Emma, gathered at the rusted gates. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a spirit box, they entered the building. The air inside was heavy and damp, the scent of mildew and decay clinging to every surface. Graffiti covered the peeling walls, and shards of glass from shattered windows crunched underfoot. "This place gives me the creeps," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the echoing silence. Jason smirked. "That's the point, isn't it? Let's see if this haunted hospital lives up to the hype." The group moved cautiously through the darkened corridors. Their flashlights illuminated rusted gurneys, discarded medical equipment, and faded posters warning about hygiene practices. The atmosphere was oppressive, and every creak of the old building made them jump. As they ventured deeper into the hospital, they reached the surgical wing. The air was colder here, and their breath fogged in front of them. Jason, ever the skeptic, suggested they split up to cover more ground. Reluctantly, the group agreed. Sarah and Mia explored the patient rooms, finding dusty beds with restraints still attached. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she noticed scratches on the walls, as though someone had desperately tried to escape. Meanwhile, Jason and Liam entered the operating theater. A rusted operating table stood in the center of the room, and surgical tools lay scattered on a tray. Jason picked up a scalpel, its blade dull and stained. "Looks like they left in a hurry," he muttered. Emma stayed behind in the hallway, keeping watch. As the others investigated, she swore she heard faint whispers. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, morphing into agonized moans. Emma turned toward the sound, her flashlight flickering. At the end of the hallway, a shadow moved. "Guys!" she screamed, backing up. The group rushed to her, their flashlights converging on the empty corridor. "I saw something," Emma stammered. "There was someone down there." Jason rolled his eyes. "It's just your imagination. Let's keep going." But as they turned to leave, the shadow reappeared, closer this time. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The group froze in terror as the figure let out a guttural growl and began to move toward them. Panic set in as the friends ran blindly through the maze-like corridors, the shadowy figure pursuing them. Doors slammed shut on their own, cutting off potential escape routes. The building seemed alive, twisting and shifting to keep them inside. Mia tripped over a fallen chair and screamed as the shadow loomed over her. Jason grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. but the figure didn't follow. Instead, it pointed to a door marked Morgue. "I think it wants us to go in there," Liam whispered, his voice shaking. "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed. "We're not going in there." "Do we have a choice?" Jason shot back. The figure blocked their path, its hollow eyes fixed on them. Reluctantly, they pushed open the heavy morgue door and stepped inside. The room was freezing, their breath visible in the dim light. Steel drawers lined the walls, many of them slightly ajar. One drawer creaked open on its own, revealing a pristine white sheet covering a human shape. Emma whimpered. "This is a bad idea." Jason approached the drawer, his flashlight shaking in his hand. As he reached to pull back the sheet, the figure from the hallway appeared in the corner of the room, its hollow eyes glowing brighter. The door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into darkness. The room was deathly silent, except for the sound of their rapid breathing. Jason fumbled with his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn back on. Sarah's phone provided the only faint glow, illuminating their frightened faces. A deep, resonant voice echoed in the darkness, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Why have you come?" it asked, the words dripping with malice. Emma clung to Mia. "What do you want from us?" she cried, her voice breaking. The voice didn't answer, but the drawers began to creak open one by one, each revealing an empty space. More words were scratched into the steel, forming a grim message. "You are the next." The group huddled together, panic setting in. Jason, trying to keep calm, noticed a faint glow emanating from one of the drawers at the far end of the room. "Over there," he whispered, pointing. As they approached the glowing drawer, the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic. The light pulsed rhythmically, almost as if beckoning them closer. Jason reached out and opened the drawer fully. Inside was an old, leather-bound book, with a key resting on top of it. "Take it," Sarah urged, her eyes darting around the room. Jason hesitated, but eventually grabbed the key. The moment he did, the whispers stopped, replaced by an ear-splitting shriek. The figure reappeared, blocking their path to the door. "It's a trap!" Liam yelled, but Jason shook his head. "No, it's a test," he said, clutching the key tightly. "We need to figure out what this thing wants." He opened the book, revealing pages filled with names and dates. His breath caught when he saw their names at the bottom, the current date listed beside them. The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes burning brighter. Jason quickly turned the page, finding another cryptic message. "To leave, you must finish the story." "What does that mean?" Emma asked, tears streaming down her face. Jason looked at the glowing key in his hand, and then back at the figure. "I think it means we have to write our own ending." The next story is "The Smiling Man 'Twas late, the streets almost deserted, when Ethan decided to take the long walk home. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. The streetlights cast dim pools of light, and the city felt eerily empty. Ethan noticed him first under a flickering street lamp. A man, tall and thin, wearing a dark suit that seemed oddly pristine given the hour. His face was turned away, but something about his posture sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He kept walking, quickening his pace slightly, but when he glanced back, the man had turned to face him. The smile was the first thing Ethan noticed. It stretched impossibly wide, too perfect, too sharp. The man's eyes were fixed on him, unblinking, and as Ethan stared, the man began to move. Not walk, glide, as though his feet barely touched the ground. Ethan's heart raced. He tried to convince himself it was a prank, some eccentric playing a joke, but the man's movements were too unnatural. He changed his path, crossing the street, but when he looked back, the smiling man was there, still gliding toward him, his head tilted slightly, as if studying him. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, hoping to break the spell of fear creeping over him. "What do you want?" The smiling man stopped. For a moment, the world felt unnervingly still. Then, without a word, he tilted his head back and began to laugh. The sound was high-pitched and hollow, echoing unnaturally down the empty street. Ethan turned and ran. No matter how fast Ethan ran, the smiling man followed. His laughter echoed behind him, growing louder and more distorted. When Ethan finally dared to glance back, he saw the man closer than before. His movements jerky, yet somehow fluid, like a puppet on invisible strings. Ethan ducked into an alley, hoping to lose him. He pressed his back against the wall, straining to hear anything over the sound of his own labored breathing. The alley was dark, and for a moment, he thought he'd escaped. But then he heard it, the faint scrape of shoes on asphalt. The smiling man emerged from the shadows, his grin wider than ever, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring Ethan's fear. Desperate, Ethan grabbed a broken pipe, lying nearby, and brandished it. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The smiling man stopped, tilting his head as though considering. Then he did something Ethan would never forget. He mimicked him. His hands curled, as if holding an invisible pipe, his body adopting the same defensive posture. And then he began to walk forward, mirroring Ethan's every step. Ethan's mind raced. He feinted to the left, then to the right, but the smiling man mirrored him perfectly, his smile never faltering. Panic surged as Ethan realized he couldn't outmaneuver him. Without thinking, he hurled the pipe at the smiling man and bolted down the alley. Behind him, the laughter returned, louder and more manic than before. Ethan ran until his lungs burned, until he stumbled out onto a main street filled with people. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, and looked back. The smiling man was gone. No one believed Ethan's story. His friends laughed it off, and the police dismissed it as a prank. But Ethan knew better. He moved to a new neighborhood, avoided walking alone at night, and tried to convince himself it was over. But sometimes, late at night, he would hear faint laughter outside his window. And when he looked out, the street would be empty, except for a faint shadow under a flickering street lamp. Next story is The Slender Man. The Slender Man was an enigma that had lived on the fringes of the internet for years. First appearing as part of an online forum contest to create something terrifying, the faceless figure with unnaturally long limbs quickly grew into a myth that blurred the lines between fiction and reality. The story spread like wildfire, with users across the globe adding their own encounters and theories, weaving a tapestry of fear. For a group of teenagers in a small rural town, the Slender Man was more than a story. It was a challenge. Abby, Tyler, Sam, and Mia had grown up hearing the tales, but they dismissed them as online nonsense. That is, until strange things started happening in the woods near their homes. Animals were found mutilated, their remains arranged in intricate patterns. Trees bore deep scratches, as though something with impossibly long claws had carved into them. And then there were the whispers, soft, haunting voices that seemed to come from nowhere, always drawing the listener deeper into the forest. "We have to check it out," Tyler said one evening. his voice a mix of fear and excitement. The others hesitated, but ultimately agreed. Armed with flashlights and their phones, they ventured into the woods, determined to prove the myth wrong. The forest was eerily quiet as the group made their way along the narrow trails. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made every snap of a twig feel deafening. Abby clutched her flashlight tightly, her heart pounding with each step. "This is stupid," Mia whispered. "We should just go home." "Come on, Mia," Tyler replied, trying to sound confident. "It's just a story. There's nothing out here." But even Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of their eyes, and the air felt colder with every step they took. Suddenly, Sam stopped. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The group froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of static crackled through the air, like an old television struggling to find a signal. It grew louder, closer, until it was almost deafening. And then they saw him. Standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trees, was a tall, impossibly thin figure. His featureless face seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and his long, spindly arms hung unnaturally at his sides. The group stared, paralyzed by fear, as the slender man took a single, deliberate step toward them. "Run!" Abby screamed, breaking the spell. The group scattered, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they sprinted through the forest. The static grew louder, disorienting them, and the shadows seemed to shift, blocking their path. Tyler tripped over a root, landing hard on the ground. He looked up to see the slender man standing over him, his faceless head tilting, as though observing him. Tyler screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the static. When the others looked back, Tyler was gone. The remaining three ran until they burst out of the forest and onto the road. Gasping for air, they looked back, but the woods were silent once more. There was no sign of Tyler or the slender man. Days turned into weeks, but Tyler was never found. The police conducted a search, but the case went cold. Abby, Sam, and Mia rarely spoke about what happened that night, each haunted by the memory of the faceless figure. But sometimes, late at night, they would hear static crackling outside their windows. And they knew the slender man was still watching. The next story is The Whispering Mirror. It was an unassuming antique shop, tucked away on a forgotten side street of the bustling city. The air inside was heavy with the smell of aged wood and faded memories. Among the oddities and trinkets, a peculiar mirror caught Elisa's attention. It was tall, with an ornate silver frame carved into intricate patterns of vines and roses. The glass was impossibly clear, as though it had never aged. The shopkeeper, a frail old man with a voice that barely rose above a whisper, seemed reluctant to sell it. "This mirror, it's unique," he said, his eyes darting nervously to the glass. "But some things are better left untouched." Elise dismissed his warnings as a sales tactic. She was furnishing her new apartment and needed a centerpiece. The mirror, though eerie, felt perfect. After some haggling, she left the shop with her purchase, unaware of the darkness she was bringing into her home. The mirror fit perfectly in Elisa's living room, leaning against the wall opposite her couch. For the first few days, it seemed like just another piece of decor. But then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint. Soft murmurs she could barely hear as she passed by. She assumed it was her imagination or the hum of the city outside her window. But the whispers grew louder at night, distinct words she couldn't quite understand. They weren't coming from her apartment, but from the mirror itself. One evening, while brushing her hair in front of the mirror, Elise noticed something unusual. Her reflection smiled at her, a split-second grin that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She froze, staring at the glass, but her reflection was perfectly normal again. Just tired, she muttered to herself, turning off the lights and heading to bed. But the whispers followed her, growing louder as she drifted into a restless sleep. One night, Elise woke to find her room bathed in an unnatural light. It was coming from the mirror, its surface glowing faintly. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding. As she stood before the mirror, the whisper stopped, replaced by a soft, almost soothing voice. "Come closer," it said. Elise hesitated, but found herself stepping forward as though compelled. Her reflection stared back, but something was off. The eyes were darker, and the expression too neutral, too hollow. "You've been watching me," Elise whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" The reflection tilted its head, mimicking her movements. "I'm you," it replied, though its lips didn't move. "But you can join me? It's better here, quieter." Before Elise could respond, the reflection's hand pressed against the glass from the other side. The surface rippled like water. The hand extended out, cold and solid, gripping her wrist. Elise screamed, trying to pull away, but the mirror's pull was relentless. Her reflection smiled again, its grin impossibly wide as it dragged her closer. She clawed at the frame, her nails breaking as she struggled. The whispers returned, a deafening chorus of voices urging her to let go. The next morning, Elise's apartment was quiet. The mirror stood in its usual spot, its surface pristine and still. A faint shadow lingered behind the glass, its shape familiar, but distorted. When Elise's friend Mia came to visit, she found the apartment unlocked and empty. The mirror caught her attention immediately. It seemed to hum softly, drawing her closer. Mia frowned, leaning in to examine the glass. For a moment, she thought she saw Elise's face staring back at her, but the expression wasn't one she recognized. It was a smile, wide, cold, and impossibly perfect. And then the whispers began again,